We have in a previous video established that after 2 decades of lost development and a negative economic growth for most African nations between 1980 and 2000, the last 20 years has been drastically better, with most African nations having economies 2, 3 or 4 times larger today than in the year 2000. You can find that video linked in the description. But we also established that many African nations are falling behind and remain at the bottom of the list in regards to economic development. Let us try to delve into why that is. Our role model for a poor nation becoming rich is China, nothing but China. And the African nations are not China. Many nations in Africa are fighting problems that China did not have to fight. Africa is divided with borders that do not match languages and ethnical groups. They are mostly drawn by Europeans in regards to natural boundaries or just straight borders through the desert. Like Henk Wessling points to in Divide and Rule, the borders of Africa were quite uniquely not drawn as a result of power struggles over time. Rather, they were drawn first, and then the power struggles developed in response to them. Partly as a result of that, many African nations have unrest, or have very recently had unrest or even civil wars. Meanwhile, China is to 90% made up of the same ethnical group, the largest in the world. We shouldn't also dismiss the impact that the relation between the African empires and the rest of the world in the centuries before colonization had. The slave trade with the Western powers, as well as with the Ottoman Empire, had the result of not only draining the continent of strong individuals, but also supporting wars and conflict between African empires that were already ongoing. The effects of the slave trade over centuries resulted in that the African nations were less ready for the Industrial Revolution, where European nations took advantage of having population enough to allocate a smaller share of them for industrial production. The African economies had also grown dependent on the slave trade and had a hard time adapting when it ended in the 1800s. All this led up to the European colonization in the late 19th century, when new technologies made it economically sustainable to ship heavy resources away from the African continent overseas. China also saw its share of economic interference from Europe throughout history, but nothing like the African nations did, especially not in the 20th century. I will cover foreign aid and the effects it had on many African nations in a separate video, so we will not go much into that here. Some find pointing to a colonial past as an explanation for the current state of affairs, as an excuse to point blame away from poor leadership. And of course, all nations are responsible for their development. But there is no doubt that colonialism and postcolonialism have had an impact on many African nations. Not all of them, not everywhere and to the same extent, but it has had an impact. Tim Marshalls in Prisoners of Geography see connections between civil unrest in nations like Sudan, Kenya, Angola, Nigeria and Mali, and recklessly drawn borders. And maybe there is no better example of this than Congo. At the heart of Africa, the nation has seen the deadliest war in the world since World War II, and points us to another aspect regarding colonialism that we must not forget. Different colonial powers left their former colonies in varied states of well-being, while India, for example, and to some extent South Africa, decolonialized with a well-functioning railway system that is still very much in use today. Africa as a whole, not so much. There are for sure railways in Africa from colonial days, but they rarely connect or pass over national borders. They rarely even connect major cities, but much more often connect ports with natural resources. Africa was to the Europeans, to a higher extent than many other regions, a place for resource extraction. Extraction of minerals and food and of people. Many African nations chose a socialist direction after independence, with large national corporations in charge of natural resources. This was for many nations probably a poor decision, but a natural result after decades of colonial rule. No matter how liberal and capitalist the colonial powers were back home, most colonies were ruled in a very socialist way, with no private entrepreneurship. The African continent, with its poor communication in between nations, found it difficult to trade with each other. And when Western powers enforced adaptation to a free market by the 1980s to continue receiving aid, many nations only privatized on paper, with institutions sold to government officials and their families. The strong leaders that came to power before democratization consolidated their power while only making small changes to please Western nations and institutions. They were also helped with numerous military interventions by former colonial powers that helped alleviate opposition. To go back to China, it is also surrounded with nations that saw similar development as China. Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, and more have seen great economic growth alongside China. South Korea, and especially Japan, were already developed. This positive synergy has not been seen in Africa to the same extent. It is difficult to develop when a civil war on the other side of your border keeps giving you problems. During the first decades of their independence, many African nations had a lack of educated inhabitants, suited to take more advanced occupations. The colonial powers had not focused on educating the people, and the few that were often saw opportunities abroad, contributing to the brain drain from the African continent to Europe and North America. We should also use a minute or two to talk about geographical difficulties. Africa is to a large extent located in the tropics, where disease is much more prevalent than further north and south. A higher prevalence of communicable diseases, not the least malaria, has a clear negative impact on development. Generally, coastal nations developed faster than landlocked nations. This is true with some exceptions throughout the world. This also results in more people living closely to the coast. But in Eastern Africa, the weather patterns mean that the coastal areas are quite dry, and the inlands see a much higher precipitation, and hence higher agricultural yields. This is why the population density is so high in places like Rwanda and Uganda. Africa is also lacking rivers that are good for transportation, like Europe, for example, has plentiful of. The rivers of Africa are filled with steep waterfalls and other natural obstacles, making them beautiful tourist attractions, but poor for traveling. This, in combination with a poor infrastructure of roads and railroads, mean that overland transportation of goods is very expensive in Africa. From the West, our perspective on the nations of Africa is counterproductive in several ways. First of all, after all this time, we still insist on talking about the continent as a whole, rather than its independent nations. As we have covered in this video, there is no doubt that there are troubled nations in Africa. Nations that are still on the brink of taking those first few steps out of extreme poverty, or that are continuously drawn back down due to poor, corrupt leadership and civil war. But there are also middle-income nations in Africa that are seeing a much faster economic development than we ever saw in the West, that have been working democracies for decades and that are using its natural resources in a way that is benefiting its population, and that will become high-income nations with the same problems that faces Europe and the US today, probably in just a few decades. It is of course not a development that is inevitable, but the direction is clear. All that economic opportunity that exists in Africa, in its young population, in its natural resources, and in its agricultural lands, has and will result in economic development. Not everywhere, all at once and right now, but in most places. We also fail to assess the situation in Africa because of our own level of development. Like Hans Rosling points to in Factfulness, from a high podium, all below look equally poor. We fail to see the difference between living on $1 per day and $10 per day. Some of us even fail to see the difference between living on $10 or $100 or $1,000 per day. In high-income nations, at least in democratic ones, everyone is rich. The cleaner, the nurse, the factory worker. They all belong in the top 10% of the world, maybe even in the top 1%. And many of us have been rich for generations. We fail to remember the incredible development that occurs when you go from not having food security to having it, from not affording education to affording it, from barely affording proper shoes, to affording a bicycle, to affording a motorbike, to affording a car. We must work really hard to see the tremendous change that is happening in the nations where the population is going from affording a bicycle to a motorbike. To us, Africa, as one entity, is still poor, because compared to the security and welfare we are enjoying, they are. But compared to other nations, compared to themselves a couple of decades ago, it is fussier. We also tend to see poor people as lazy. We blame the fact that they are poor on their culture. This was the view of the Japanese in the 1800s by the Europeans. A century of economic development later, and that is definitely not our image of the Japanese today. Of course, with this, we also see our own culture as the reason for why we are rich, and look away from important facts like geographical location and luck, and how we generated wealth by taking resources far from our own land throughout history. I will not attempt to say one thing that has caused the African nations to lag behind the rest of the world in economic development. There are at least as many stories to tell as there are nations on the African continent. But I personally believe that a troubled past does not necessarily mean a troubled future, as we have seen in the numbers in the first part of this video. Rather, it is true that many African nations already have escaped its past. Today, African nations are cooperating and establishing free trade agreements to a much higher degree. Basic diseases are fought successfully, and more nations are ruled democratically. And many African nations now have an educated population that can help in developing areas of state building that are still lacking. You can hear more about this positive change in the first part of this video, that is linked below if you haven't seen it already. There is a great paradox in the world of foreign aid. While most seem to talk about how poorly it is working, and even how it has had a counterproductive effect on receiving nations, we are giving more than ever before. We will try to uncover what can be made from this in a later video. These videos take a long time to research, film and edit, so if you enjoyed watching this, please consider helping me spread the video by liking and commenting what you thought of it. You can also become a member on my channel to support me directly. I will see you in the next one.